I'm here to advocate the 3-thread narrow stitch on your serger or your overlock machine, and I might use those interchangeably. It's one of the most misunderstood stitches on your serger as far as I'm concerned. So what are the virtues of our 3-thread that I'm trying to talk you into using? Number one, it's the stitch that allows the most stretch. There's no fourth needle thread or second needle thread in there, and like in your fourth thread, causing a stable stitch. This 3-thread stretches, so it stretches the most. It has the least amount of bulk. Often I get the question, well, I'm afraid it's not strong enough if it's 3 threads. I want you to reflect on this one little statement, or actually a question I'm going to ask you. How many threads are in your sewing machine? 2. And you feel secure with your sewing machine, so I think you should feel secure with 3 threads in your serger, because I do, and I am secure. I make children's clothes that way. I'm trying to think when I don't use my 3-thread to construct, and it's probably if I am using a woven fabric to construct on my serger. So many people believe a 4-thread stitch is more secure or stronger than the 3-thread stitch. That's not always true, because if I have a garment, especially something like a leotard or something gets stretched a lot, somebody's workout leggings, this thing really gets stretched to the max sometimes. And if you have that 4-thread, what will happen is that it's the thread that's in the sort of to the right on your stitch. It's the one that's closest to the cut edge. It will pop because it's a stabilizing stitch, and we don't want a stable stitch all the time. So it will pop, and then what happens is in that particular spot you're going to have a 3-thread wide that allows your seam to open up. So a 4-thread is not always particularly more secure than a 3-thread. I have an outfit that is totally constructed with a 3-thread narrow on my serger. I've worn it, it's been washed, I've thrown it in a suitcase, I threw it in a suitcase dirty for a week and then washed it, and all of my seams are still intact. Last night I had on a pair of leggings that were totally constructed with a 3-thread narrow on a nylon spandex fabric, printed fabric, and I did aerial yoga in them, including doing splits and exercises, 4 splits and handstands, and wrapping myself up in the silk, and they are still intact, and they have been washed several times. I would say at least 10 times. So when you bought your serger, it may have come threaded with 4 threads. There's also 5-thread serger out there, and usually when it comes packaged, it will come threaded, and all of those thread spaces will be used by the manufacturer, and they've got sometimes a test stitch there or something. This is not your only options when you're using your serger. There can be a 2-thread, a 3-thread, a 4-thread, a 5-thread, and this is not on all sergers. So your basic anatomy of your 3-thread narrow stitch is that you have 1 needle with a needle thread, and it is in your right needle space. So that would be the needle that's closest to the throat of the machine, okay? And then you have a top looper, and you have a lower looper. Those loopers, they're going over and being caught by that needle thread, and the stitch is forming, and it's like a crochet almost. The first thing I want you to do when you're attempting to be successful with a 3-thread narrow is to get out your owner's manual. And I want you to understand the stitch. I want you to understand what the settings are supposed to be. And what I mean by settings is the tensions, if you have tensions on your serger or your overlock machine. I want you to understand what needles are supposed to be in and what needles are not supposed to be in. Because we've had people say, well, this is a lousy stitch, and then they show us a picture of their machine and they've got 2 needles in, and 2 needles and 2 loopers would equal 4 threads. We want to only equal 3 threads, so that's 1 needle, 2 loopers, okay? There's a start right there. So nobody's gonna make that mistake now. So we're one step ahead. Okay, good thread. I've got good thread. I can have stretch thread, or I can have just really I like a good polyester thread. If you use a good cotton thread, it's gonna hold for a while. But I have this saying, cotton is rotten. And what that means is cotton wears out, okay? Cotton is a natural fiber, so it doesn't last forever. And there's many things that can make cotton go rotten. Moisture or not enough moisture, sunlight, too much laundering. We know laundering can wear clothes out. So I wouldn't use cotton. I would use a polyester thread. That would be, or a nylon type thread that is referred to often as woolly nylon. Then we have another thread called a stretch thread that is also nylon. How are we successful with this 3-thread narrow that I'm still talking to you about? You're going to love this once you get this. One way is I am not going to stretch my fabric through my serger between the foot and the feed dogs, okay? I'm not going to stretch it. I'm going to let it do its job. When I start to stretch that fabric, going under those needles and through those gizmos, what happens is I narrow the fabric up. So then what will that equal? That will equal less fabric in my seam allowance for those threads to overlock or knit around. I want a nice flat seam that my threads can lay on, wrap around, and secure themselves. When I'm talking about feeding your fabric through, I'm saying don't stretch it, but the other thing you need to do is you need to support this fabric. And what I'm saying and what I'm intending to get across to you is there's a blade on your machine and the fabric passes by this blade. And what I want is I don't want that fabric falling away from that blade. And if you see that fabric start to fall away from that blade, you may just have to take your hand a little bit and give a little bit of a support or sometimes even a nudge to make sure that fabric stays nice up close to that blade. So the blade's cutting my fabric, and after the blade cuts my fabric, I do not want that fabric to move towards the left side of my machine. I want it to stay in the same place. If you've got a big garment, don't let it hang off your table. I really have a habit of putting garments over my shoulder, and that helps me a lot. So if you support that fabric, it's not getting pulled away from that blade, and those stitches aren't being put on there without enough fabric in them to hold. So I think that's what is happening with a lot of the people that aren't successful. The other thing that's happening is poor stitch formation. So you don't have the correct tension. Make sure you go back to those manufacturer's settings and make sure that's what you've got going on. If that's still unsatisfactory, you may need to play with them a little bit, or you actually may need to service your machine, and that's a possibility. Now, what happens if I'm getting a ripple? What happens if it's not going through well enough? A lot of you have a differential feed, and you can adjust this. And you can adjust it for the fabric and how you want your seam to look. Now, I want to tell you something. For years, I used a serger without a differential feed, and I did just fine. What did I do to make it just fine? It's called practice, practice, practice. The other thing is, I became that person who decided to do a test stitch instead of the person that wished they had done a test stitch. The other thing is, make sure you've got good needles and you've got needles correct for that fabric. It's not going to be needles, right? Because a 3-thread takes only one needle. So your one needle is going to be a good needle that works on that fabric, and it's new and it's not bent, and you've got a good clean stitch. If you're having problems with that 3-thread narrow, it's not the nature of the stitch to be a problem. It might be that your stitch is not properly forming. In fact, I would say that's probably it. Or you could have really, really lousy thread. And we've talked about this before in a lot of things. good thread means a good stitch. If you don't start with good thread and a good needle, you're not going to have good stitches. Another thing we've got to be concerned with is our stitch length. What I see a lot of people do, and it's an error, and it's an error that kind of makes sense in a way. You know, you think more stitches mean a more secure seam, and it doesn't. What it means is, it means a less pliable, a less workable seam, and it also means a seam with too much bulk. So when you see those stitches all lined up together and they're covering all of that seam allowance and you don't see any fabric through those stitches, you know for sure it's too tight. That is absolutely too tight. The way you're going to test your seam is you're going to set manufacturer's settings and you're going to do a sample on the fabric you're using. And then you take that sample and you stretch it every way you can think to stretch. And if you're happy with it, that's the one you want. If you're not, you may have to tighten it up. You may have to loosen it up. I use a pretty loose seam, it seems like, most of the time. A lot of times the manufacturer's length will be 3 and I'll go to a 3/5. That may also depend on how you are with manipulating your fabric and how you support your fabric. So think about that too. But look at your seam, look at how you sew, and again, test and you'll be happy. Another thing we talk about is how do we secure seams? Well, the first way you secure a seam is when you've made one seam and then you're sewing over an intersecting seam. That will secure the last seam that you have stitched. Now, what happens when I get to that intersecting seam and maybe it doesn't run quite as smoothly, or my blade doesn't, go through that quite as well? I may have to slow down. Some of you may even have to walk your serger and use your hand wheel through that. The other thing is, if that blade is not cutting that nice and clean, you either need a new blade, and it might not be that you need a new blade. It might be that this is really bulky and just fabric that's hard to cut. Maybe that blade's never going to cut it. But if you don't need a new blade, what you may have to do is go in there with a pair of scissors before you ever put this fabric under the presser foot and clip where you're going to have that blade go past that intersecting seam. Because once you get a drag on that, what that drag is going to do is pull that seam or that fabric away from your stitches again, and you're not going to get a good full seam allowance in those knitted stitches. Another way is to leave a tail at the end, both ends. If you have 2 ends, you leave it at both ends. If you have 1 end, you leave it at 1 end. And then what you do is, we use a double-eyed needle. It's our favorite tool, but you will take that tail, you pull the tail a little bit, you thread it through the eye of the needle, and then you thread it back up through the stitches. I then pull it and clip it and then pull that seam straight again, and it will hide right back in that line of stitching. Another way is to use a seam sealant. One of our favorites is Overlock. You may have one that you're happy with too, but I really do like Overlock a lot. The last one I'm going to mention seems to be the least popular in general because it's a little bit difficult. And what that is to do is to stitch back over your seam you've just made with your serger. So you stitch over it, you bring your fabric behind your presser foot, you flip it in front, and you stitch back over it because you can't back stitch. So you have to flip that fabric. So that seems to be the least popular, and it's probably the most inconvenient.